to have Jack Segal speak to us tonight on what's wrong with the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out on a chilly evening. I also want to thank the Woodmere Library for everything that's been set up for us. Tonight's topic is a very ambitious one, and I was given an hour, and I wanted to leave half of that for questions and answers. So to address the entire Middle East in 30 minutes is more than ambitious. There's probably a better word in the Webster's for that. When you start with a topic that says what's wrong with the Middle East, obviously you're assuming something. And yeah, there is a lot wrong with the Middle East, and it's not new. It's not all that unusual, in fact. The Middle East has been in turmoil, one could argue, for as long as the term Middle East has been understood, or as long as outsiders have ventured into that area, certainly for 2,000 years. One of the wonders of working in the Middle East was I would spend quite a bit of time in Jerusalem, and for this particular group it was interesting to recall that on top of a hilltop, a flattened out hilltop, is a place called the Dome of the Rock, which is the site where Muhammad is believed to have stepped off the earth and into heaven, and his footprint is in a rock, is imprinted on a rock, which is in this building called the Dome of the Rock. Next to it is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Just below there and down is a wall, which is the retaining wall of the second temple of King David, the holiest site in Judaism. And 150 meters from there is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which encases the hill where Jesus was crucified. So within a very, very tightly knit area of Old Jerusalem are the three of the most holy sites in the three large Western religions. And they have unfortunately sparked a great deal of tension and conflict. When Karen and I were serving in the Middle East, we had the first Palestinian uprising, the Intifada, and we had at the end the Gulf War when Saddam Hussein was firing Scud missiles at us in Tel Aviv, where we lived. The fundamental challenges of the region really go to the poverty, the unemployment, the lack of education at the individual level, at the societal level, the rapid urbanization and growth of the population, the shortage of critical resources, particularly water, the conflict at this regional level of Israel and Palestine, the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I teach a course on that subject, and it's a complicated one. When I say the Israelis, I'm talking about 7 million people, 20% of whom are Arabs. The country of Israel made up of several different slices of Jews and Christians and Muslims and non-Muslim Arabs, and a very complicated mix. And then the Palestinian community, equally complex and diverse. And then I won't speak much in the next remarks about the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and I will also skip over the Iran nuclear issue, both of which are huge subjects, in order to get to stay close to my timeline. Now, I would acknowledge that there's a new level of complexity in the Middle East, and it results from our getting more involved in a way that we perhaps never intended to. I will take your questions at the end of this talk, but many of the crises that are really flaring up into what many analysts call the most complex and most dangerous situation in the Middle East in our lifetime, and maybe in hundreds of years, is right now, and it starts there at 9/11. An attack came from halfway around the world by a group that most of us had never heard of. we were stunned, and 3,000 people were dead in one day. And we began something that was called by the president the War on Terror, as he stood on the rubble of these two gigantic buildings and several other buildings that were destroyed. And so he talked about this war on terror and how anyone who was not with us was against us. But the goals of this war were unclear. The field of battle was undefined, and the enemy was vague, and the enemy was dispersed. So we began to see a parade of strange new images. Afghanistan, even somebody who we identified as an American Taliban. The Taliban themselves. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why didn't we know anything about them? What do they believe? The new enemy, a new war, echoes though of one that was fought and lost by the Soviet Union in the same place. But the war started in Afghanistan, and for 2 years, I started going there in 2002, and there wasn't really much war to speak of. The Taliban government had been evicted, replaced by warlords, gangs, gangsters, profiteers, some American, some Afghan, some other countries. Lots of people exploiting a situation, and generally a population that I was able to travel around with my boss in unarmored vehicles and meet with calmly, and they were talking about how glad they were to see us because these religious fanatics had been kicked out, and that we were going to settle things down and help them get started, and that would be it. But it's not exactly what happened. By 2003, the government in Washington had gotten, let's say, tired of Afghanistan, or wanted to look for something more fundamentally close to what the US interests were. And so they came up with a different target, Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And that's our old adversary. We had fought against him in the first Gulf War in when was that? 91. And we had really started what began as a liberation from a dictator, which then collapsed into the destruction of a society. It was a society that was run by a dictatorship, no doubt, no question of that, and a brutal one at that killed many of its own people. But what happened by toppling that dictatorship was we created a power vacuum, and that vacuum began to be filled by factions that had been kept under the thumb of this dictator. We conducted a rather futile search for weapons of mass destruction, and we unearthed something unexpected: fundamentalism. The groups that split apart when in this destruction of the state called Iraq, they became more and more radicalized and more religiously focused and more separate from each other. At first it was sort of a shorthand, you're a Sunni, I'm a Shia. But then it became, what kind of Sunni are you? How Sunni are you? How radical, how devoted are you to the scripture that is called the Holy Quran? And so we had severed the ties of a dictatorship, and we created more intense rivalry that had been going on and had been in the background for 1,400 years. The Sunnis and the Shia disagree on the proper succession from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so they, and you should say that if you use that word in respect. Two factions, one centered in Iran and another centered in Saudi Arabia. And they emerged this kind of split that's based on religious belief. It's based on tribal connections. It's based on the fact that there had been an equilibrium of sorts that had developed over the last 1,000 years. And so that that equilibrium, though, was shaken by the collapse of the Iraqi regime. So out of this chaos in Iraq came something called the Islamic State in Iraq and the Sham, ISIS. And from ISIS came a splinter group known as of Al-Qaeda that moved over into Syria. Our Al-Qaeda, our opponent, our enemy in Afghanistan, the one that replaced the Taliban. Al-Qaeda's new operation in Syria established itself in the midst of an ongoing civil war. A Shia regime, the Shiite leader, and actually an Alawite Shiite, so a subgroup of Shiism, the Hafez al-Assad's son, Bashar al-Assad, the leader of a relatively secular country, Syria, found himself surrounded by opposition and weakened, and a civil war that developed, ironically enough for you environmentalists, from a drought. A drought in the north of Syria that was not addressed by the government and led to the groups within the north who began to get together first on political reasons, that they wanted to oppose the regime's inaction, and then later on the social and cultural and religious grounds. And so this thing pulled itself together into an opposition movement. And the opposition grew because the leader was not popular. And he was not one of them. He was a Shiite, a minority in a majority Sunni country. And so these diverging forces began to take hold. Now, Syria today looks like this, which is to say there is no Syria to go back to. There is now an area, the green being the opposition or the greenish, the red being this thing called ISIS, the dotted reddish thing being the al-Nusra Front, a Al-Qaeda offshoot, but not friendly with ISIS. The Kurds up in the north, and then a little spot up in the very top of the map at a place we know as Kobani, which is also called Ain al-Arab. And then a number of areas that are being hotly contested, and way down in the bottom on the left, the Israelis control a little corner of Syria called the Golan Heights. So you have what used to be a country. Now, where did this country come from? It's a very interesting story. I won't have time to go into it in detail, but let's just say that two Europeans in 1916 sat down with a map of the Middle East. They got out a ruler, they drew a straight line, and they said, this part will be French and this part will be British. And so the French part you're looking at, Syria and Lebanon. The British part, Iraq and Palestine, were the British side of the equation. In 3.5 years of civil war, we have, through bombing and through battles with Kurdish fighters, we have seen basically the destruction of many cities in Syria, and these cities will not come back. They are rubble, and so if they are going to be reconstituted, it will take decades. This is not unique to Syria or the Middle East. If you look at it, Ukraine, you can see this beginning to happen now in eastern Ukraine. To bring it up close to present time, we had an incident, a period of time where Israel and the Gazans battled it out. It looked like a very unfair fight. If you talk to an Israeli, you'll get a different take on this. Let it be said that rockets were coming out of Gaza, bombs were going in. A great deal of bloodshed and a great deal of destruction, and up to this day, very little in the way of reconstruction. So what do we have? We have these Islamic radicals suddenly appearing on our doorstep, basically, and They have brought new images to our minds, new images that we don't like to look at. I'm just going to go through them very quickly. A destroyed city, Kobani, that I mentioned. People about to be killed. This I found interesting in how they define this man who was shot down, a Jordanian pilot, as a crusader, that term from the ancient times, and how it was their great fortune with through the will of Allah to shoot down his plane, and then of course to so brutally kill him. An eye for an eye. They killed then the suicide bomber they held for 5 years. This cancer spread while hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Syria. We got very, very worked up about 14 people who were killed in Paris. Why? Because it's closer to home. It's something we could see happening on TV and nearby and in familiar territory. So what is ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, the Islamic State anyway? It is religiously based. It is an ultra-radical Salafist Sunni organization. Salafism is a branch of the Sunni culture, let's call it, that calls for a very strict interpretation of the Quran, the Holy Quran, and which has no tolerance for non-believers. It exists in Middle Eastern countries, particularly in Egypt, where it developed culturally for many hundreds of years. It is not welcome or supported by the government of Egypt, but the religious leaders, the clerics who teach about it, are tolerated. There is another wing of this, which I'll get back to about when I talk about Saudi Arabia. It is well armed thanks to the Iraqi army, because the weapons that we provided to the Iraqi army were abandoned by the Iraqi army as it fled from these fighters. And so now they have modern American weapons. It's well financed by oil. It gets about $1 million a day from oil revenues, from fields it has taken control of, and from Sunni supporters. Sunnis, like Sunnis who live in Syria and want to get rid of the Shiite president of Syria. And so even though ISIS may be the devil you know a bigger devil, and that's the Shiites. And so you want to get rid of the Shiites, so you side with ISIS. It's also supported by Sunni states, and this we don't ever talk about. We pretend it's not happening. But some of our closest allies in the Middle East are Sunni kingdoms, and they are providing money and training to these Sunni, let's call them fighters. The red line shows the area they control today. There is no ISIS country on any map. You can get it National Geographic, but there it is. They hold Mosul, the second largest city in what used to be Iraq. They do not hold Kirkuk, but they tried last week to get in there. They haven't succeeded. But now you can turn to what we're being told about this new enemy. A retired general who I knew well from Afghanistan has been brought out of retirement to organize a coalition of Arab states with US air support to fight ISIS. He acknowledged 6 months ago that the Iraqi army had disappeared. It is being re-equipped and retrained with tens of billions of dollars of your money going to that, and with the hope that this time they will fight. They have a problem though. During the period in the latter stages of the time that we occupied Iraq, occupation being quite unwelcome, whether it's being done by Israelis in Palestine or Americans in Iraq. During that period, the Sunnis gained control of government, and then gradually they gained control of the leadership of the army. So the Shia took over the government and the army. Now, we have a Sunni opponent on our hands. They're happy to fight a Sunni opponent. But there are a lot of Sunnis in Iraq, like there are in Syria, who have to now choose. Do I go with the government, which is pro-Shia and supported by Iran, or do I go with fighting the Sunnis? And then we have a third player in this game, and that is the Kurds, who are looking for some way to create a home for themselves out of this mess. There'll be, the general was quite careful last week, or this week, in saying there will be a major ground offensive against ISIL in the coming weeks. The closest that I can get from anybody in Washington is we're talking about not before September that the Iraqi army will be capable of defensive operations. So what they have done is stop the advance of ISIS, because ISIS has begun to wander down towards the Shia-controlled areas. 2 brigades of troops from Iran have moved into Iraq to strengthen the opposition on the Shia side of the Iraqi battle line. And so they have pretty much held their ground. They're not going to try to take Baghdad right now. And so there's a bit of a stalemate in Iraq. So maybe during this interim 6 months or so, the Iraqi army will come back to life and will begin to fight against ISIS. We'll see. They do a lot of recruiting overseas. The incidents that occurred in Paris told us something about this, or gave us a little bit of an insight into it. A large number of young Muslims are coming out of all of these countries, particularly in Europe, to fight in Syria, to join ISIS, to join the jihad, the holy war against the infidels and their supporters. So in the category of infidels falls someone like King Abdullah, sorry, thank you, Jordan, because he is allied with us. And so that taints him, that makes him unacceptable, even though he's a Muslim. In fact, it makes it acceptable for ISIS to kill Muslims, because in their doctrine, if you are on the side of the opposition to ISIS, you are by definition opposed to Islam, because only ISIS can define what Islam is. Now, these young people are coming back to Europe in dribs and drabs, and maybe 1 or 2 to the United States. And they've been indoctrinated in an ideology, and they've been trained in military skills, and they have a mission to perform when they get back. And that mission is going to be very difficult to control. We tend to view this control mechanism as military, police, intelligence. If you want to look at something quite interesting, look at what Denmark is doing with their returnees. They are using clerics, training, job skill training, all sorts of rehabilitation, psychological work to rehabilitate their returnees, to bring them back to a normal point of view. So this is a labor-intensive effort, but I can guarantee you that, that trying to track individual terrorists or potential terrorists is also labor-intensive. So it's a choice that's being made. So we have now the situation in Syria, which seems to be unresolvable, and this cancer is now spreading. A group that had been aligned with Al-Qaeda has changed its affiliation and is now calling itself ISIS in the Sinai. And the Egyptians are now beginning a war in northern Sinai, which had to be one of the quietest places on earth when Karen and I visited there. It is not any longer. in Jordan, this refugee camp is about 50% larger than when that picture is taken. It is well managed and well maintained by the United Nations. There's water, there's food, there are beginning to be schools. Nobody's quite clear on who's teaching what in these schools, but there are no jobs. And so a generation is beginning to live in these camps in a semi-permanent basis. And if you want to look for a model of how short-sighted and dangerous that is, look at the Palestinian refugee camps in Gaza and the West Bank, because they have been in existence now, some of them since 1948. And they have the same problems built into them that all refugee camps have, and this one is just one of many. A country that's been through 3 or 4 civil wars, depends on how you count it, Lebanon, had been relatively stable until quite recently, but now the ISIS contagion is beginning to spread into Lebanon, which has a very delicate balance of Shia, Sunni, and Christians. And the bottom line human cost so far is 5 million refugees from Syria, from Iraq, spread all over the Middle East, mostly. So, you know, to answer this question, what's wrong with the Middle East? Well, it's fair to ask the question. It's a question, though, that you want to be able to have the answer to being, and here's what we're going to do about it. And I think it's time to address some of the root causes for the radicalism. I mentioned at the beginning poverty and hopelessness. There was an Israeli prime minister who I knew fairly well, who said that we will be safe in Israel when the Palestinians have hope. And that is true not just in Palestine, that's true basically everywhere. And if there is hopelessness, which there seems to be in so many places, then it's becoming more and more difficult to see how we can get these people out of the mindset that they're in. It's time to address also regimes. The United States supports very reactionary monarchies throughout the Middle East. We get oil from them. We in the case of Saudi Arabia, we get natural gas from others. In the case of Kuwait, we get a military base from Bahrain. We support these regimes without much analysis or criticism of what they do. Let's take the example of Saudi Arabia, the untouchable third rail of Middle East politics from a Washington perspective. We want Saudi Arabia to be on our side. They are a Sunni regime. Years and decades ago, when the Saudi family took over the desert area called the Hijaz and kicked out the Hashim tribe, from which the Jordanian royal family grew. When this happened, they made a deal with the religious leaders called the Wahhabi sect. And the Wahhabis teach a form of Islam that if you were a Taliban, you would find very comfortable and familiar, because they grow from each other. And this form of Islam is extremely ancient and strict and inflexible and anti-modernism. We've been horrified by beheadings that have been carried out by ISIS. Last month, 40 people were beheaded in Saudi Arabia for normal crimes, not all of which were violent crimes. It is the way they execute people. So for them, what is horrifying to us, and by the way, what happened in the French Revolution in 1789, it's normal. It's what you do. It's how you do it. So we have a huge cultural gap when we talk about women in society. I once sat across the table from a member of the Afghan parliament, and he said to me, he kind of got agitated by what was going on across the table, and he said, "You people, you want to change the way we run our society," and then he kind of stood up halfway and he pointed in my chest, and he said, "You want to change the way I live in my house, and you are never going to do that." If we want to change the way people live in their house, inside the closed doors of their homes, then we have to pay the price, or we have to say it's none of our business. It's difficult. These are not easy choices. I don't pretend that. But we are now engaged in a heavy bombing campaign. That seems to be our strategy. In Iraq, we're training. Okay, we're going to have an Iraqi Army 2.0, presumably. But in Syria, no one can explain what our strategy really is. We are training now 5,000 young Syrians who belong to one particular tribe. They're being trained in Saudi Arabia, another Sunni country. They are Sunnis. They are going to be told when you get back to Syria, you are not to take your weapons and training and point it at the hated Shiite regime. You are to point it at your fellow Sunnis, ISIS. Now, I have some concern that they may not follow our instructions on this. What can we do? Well, ultimately, we can do something like analyze the question, and this I'll close on. How much are we spending to bomb Syria and Iraq? It's generally accepted at the Pentagon that each precision-guided munition costs $1 million. We've dropped 6,000 of them so far, and we intend to intensify the bombing as the Iraqi army gets more able to stand up. Other air forces, now particularly the Jordanians have gotten into it in a big way, are bombing in Syria. The question would be, how many billions is that so far? 6 billion. And how many more billions are we going to spend doing that? And how many books could we buy if we were buying books instead of bombs? And we voters, Americans, have to ask that question. Now, I'll close with this one unpaid advertisement. You may be humanists, so I won't ask you to give to the collection at the end, although there is a collection for your organization. But I will ask you to do this, to go home and say, I don't really understand what you're trying to accomplish, and I don't think we should be spending all this money, and send that email to your representative in Congress and your 2 senators. You may think this is a useless waste of electrons, but I can guarantee you it isn't. In Washington, I know, every congressional office, they have a little intern sitting there counting. That's all they do. They don't care what you wrote. They just, when you say stop bombing Syria or stop bombing Iraq or spend more on education in the Middle East, something real short and sweet that they can put in a box on a matrix that they keep. And when they get more votes in favor of books and fewer in favor of bombs, they might actually react to that, and I hope they do. Thank you very much. And I see a first question from Ted.
Yes, Jack, would you be willing to talk a little bit about the Russian role in this whole situation?
The question is to talk about the Russian role in this whole situation. Well, like all infidels, they're involved. And so Russia has had the desire to be a big player in the Middle East from time to time. Russia has a small naval base in Syria at Latakia. And Russia has occasionally played a negotiator role. One example of the effect of public opinion on the US Congress was when the president decided to begin bombing Syria because they had used chemical weapons. And then he stopped and he let a weekend go by, and during that weekend 80% the members of Congress received an overwhelming negative feedback from their people, from their populations. And so by Monday, the idea was no longer viable politically. And then the Russians saw the opportunity and stepped up and said, well, we've always had on the shelf this plan to dismantle the Syrian chemical weapons. And believe it or not, it is happening. It is almost finished. It went on through the whole Civil War. Quietly, because nobody really wanted to try to stop it. It continued, and the destruction of those weapons has gone on. Now, Russia has a lot of irons in the fire right now outside the Middle East, but I wrote an article, a few of you may have read in the Northern Express, that Russia is involved in Syria. Russia is involved in Iran through the Iranian nuclear program, in that the Russians built the Iranian reactor at Bushehr, and Russian expertise has helped the Iranians move forward in their peaceful nuclear program. The question is whether it's been helping them in a weapons program, if they have one. It's another place where the Russians could play a role. And then, of course, you have the relationship between the group that runs Gaza, Hamas, which is a radical fundamentalist organization, but has ties to Iran and some links to Russia. If I'm starting to draw a picture that's beginning to look too complicated, you get the right picture. There's a lot of hands stirring this pot, and they're not all good people. They're not all with sort of valid, nice objectives. But I think we have to talk to Russia on that and a whole slew of other issues. When Karen was working in the Office of Soviet Union Affairs, and when we both worked in Russia together, we always had an agenda with the Russians, even when we hated each other. And we always met with them every 6 months minimum. And they would want to talk about economic opportunities, and we would want to talk about human rights. But okay, we forced each other to talk about the things we didn't want to talk about too. It can be done. Our president has not met with Putin in over 16 months. That's not acceptable. Yes, sir.
I guess I have two questions. One being, what is the ultimate aim of ISIS? Is it just to, kind of build a state out of the Sunni region that crosses between Syria and Iraq, or is it to build a state and then try to move out into the Shia regions? And then the other question is, how popular is ISIS within the Sunnis in both Syria and Iraq? Because I know at least the ones in Iraq didn't seem to really want to take part in the Shia government.
So two great questions. The first one, what are the objectives of ISIS? It's a little difficult to say. There are maps that they publish on their website, which shows a very large area that encompasses all of Syria and Iraq, including Sunni areas. They tend not to include Lebanon in those maps for reasons that I'm not really clear on, but other maps show them controlling the entire Middle East. They use the term caliphate. The caliph was the supreme leader of all Muslims, and there have been a series of caliphs, the last one being in 1914, when the Ottoman Empire still existed, and the leader of that was called the Caliph. And he covered most of then the Middle Eastern part of the Islamic world, not the Asian parts. So I think their objectives are broader than what their current territory is, but it is going to be limited by the strength of the Shia. And the Shiites are going to oppose them, and they're going to be supported by a very powerful country, Iran, in doing so. And this may create some strange partnerships, like we may find ourselves on the side of Iran against the ISIS people. In fact, maybe we're already there. We may indeed become a de facto, if not de jure, partner with the Assad regime, because they are fighting against their opponents, who happen to be primarily Sunnis. but they aren't all ISIS. Where the ISIS will be stopped, if you listen to what's coming out of the multinational coalition leadership, they've already been stopped, that they're not expanding. Tony Cordesman, who shows up on BBC quite often from the Center on Strategic and International Studies, is someone I respect greatly, who worked for a long time in this field. And he objects to the idea that ISIS is not growing. What it is strengthening its hold on the areas it's currently controlling, and it's becoming more and more like a state. So it's running the police, it's running the water department, it's collecting taxes, it's fixing the roads, and it's doing that using the people who were doing it before, who were primarily Sunnis, who may not love ISIS, like the people in Afghanistan didn't love the Taliban, but they didn't not love it enough to kick it out, because it brought with it some things that they wanted. They wanted a legal system that was not corrupt, and they got it from the Taliban, and they're getting it from ISIS. They wanted to feel safe from the other groups, the Shia, the Kurds, who were constantly pressuring them. And that has stopped in ISIS-controlled territory. Nobody is taking on ISIS with great enthusiasm except the Kurds. And so, and by the way, when I say the Kurds, anyone who came to my lecture on the Kurds will know that there are a couple hundred Kurd groups involved. So we are just using the shorthand for something that doesn't exist. Now, to the, remind me, the second part of your question again was?
The general popularity.
Yeah, the popularity I think is growing in many areas. I think people found them that when, particularly in Iraq, when the government forces, when the army disappeared, the people were given a choice basically by ISIS: you either support us or we will kill you. And they killed thousands of people, including children. They did it in such a brutal and extreme way that they terrified the population. That terror is still there. And so it's kind of like being under any army of occupation. You may not want them, but you have no tools at your disposal to get rid of them. And so you keep your mouth shut and you are safe for the time being until they, unless you somehow signal yourself out. So I don't think they're going to win any elections. On the other hand, it's fascinating if you go to the ISIS web presence, of which are many, which are frequently being brought down by our government or other governments, but they pop right back up in different forms. They have interviews with young French women who have moved to the ISIS-controlled areas, and they're saying things like, in France, I couldn't wear the hijab, I couldn't show that I was a Muslim, I had to hide the fact of who I am. Here, I am free. Now that's a thought process that we find strange, maybe, but also understandable. That they are outsiders. 25% of the population of Paris is Muslim, but they're not allowed to wear anything that identifies them as such. Jews are not allowed to wear yarmulkes, and Christians are allowed to wear crosses, but not big ones. So they live in a hostile environment in Europe, and when they get to ISIS land, they don't, and they feel comfortable. So this is a major challenge. And there was a hand over here. Yes, in the back.
I would like to know what you think the effect of Bibi Netanyahu's appearance before Congress is going to have on our policy and actions in the Middle East, if any.
What is the effect of Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel's upcoming appearance in the U.S. Congress, which was not, the President of the United States was not asked to let him come here and do that. Netanyahu is going to be here a few weeks before the Israeli elections on March 17th. He's coming in this month, soon. And he's here to attend a meeting of the America-Israel Political Action Committee, AIPAC. But he was invited by Speaker Boehner to appear before a joint session of Congress. It's unusual for a couple of reasons. They did not ask the president if it would be okay, and secondly, it's right before the Israeli election. It will have an effect on his relationship with President Obama, because Obama, I'm sure, has communicated, the White House certainly has, publicly, that they don't want it to happen. But his relationship with President Obama is almost non-existent anyway. They fundamentally disagree on a critically important issue, the Iranian nuclear program. And that can is being kicked down the road repeatedly. It's now in its third extension of time. And while these extensions are taking place, the Iranian program continues. And this is exactly what the Israelis are arguing, that this program is headed towards being on the threshold of putting together one nuclear bomb. And you could say, well, what's the big deal? You've got 200, don't you? Well, they don't admit they do, okay. Well, the big deal is that one nuclear bomb going off in Israel would be quite different from a lot of nuclear bombs going off in Iran in terms of the existence of a state of Israel. And that's a very complicated discussion, but I think our relationship with Israel is very difficult right now, because the president has such a fraught relationship with the leader. He is likely to again be the leader. It's not certain, but quite possible. And the Republican Party, in the form of the Congress, is saying that when we take over, it'll be easier for you to get what you need from us. Now, what do they want from us? If those of you who have access to Facebook, note the name Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett. He is the #2 man in Israel right now. He's the leader of the second largest party in the ruling coalition of Bibi Netanyahu. Naftali Bennett, B-E-N-N-E-T-T. He's on Facebook. He explains, he's got a video up right now about what the plan is when he and Netanyahu have a bigger majority, which they hope to have. And that would be to annex 2/3 of the West Bank and make it part of Israel, and then to give the Palestinians the remaining third under total Palestinian control. And the debate you're going to have in your mind is a hard one, because we talk about a two-state solution, and I ask people, what do you mean by that? And they mean a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. And then I say, well, what happens to the 1.2 million of Arabs that are in Israel? That's a binational state then, right? So you're talking about one state for the Palestinians and 4/5 of a state for the Jews. Or what? And so it seems clean, two-state solution, but he'll explain to you on his Facebook site why it's not acceptable to him and to a lot of Israelis. So it's going to be a complicated discussion. In the back. Yes, sir.
Are there any examples of, you mentioned trading books for bombs, are there any examples of our government being proactive with education in Middle Eastern countries?
Are there any examples of our government being proactive with education, books for bombs? It sounds like a good slogan. It's not anything that anyone who has any influence is pushing. Books are not as expensive as precision-guided munitions and drones or F-35 fighters. So they aren't attractive as a commodity to our industry. And by the way, I must add our Michigan industries. I once talked about the folly of sending Humvees to Afghanistan where nobody's educated and can't read the instructions. And I was told by a senior senator that they can't say that anymore in public because Humvees are built in Michigan. They represent jobs. So there are not a lot of examples. Actually, an interesting example is the speaker who's coming on the 19th is Cuban. Cuba has had very little money to spend on foreign aid in its communist history, which is maybe someday coming to an end. But they have spent it on training doctors and giving away textbooks. Now they're written in Spanish to poor countries in Latin America. Of course they're written by Cubans, communist Cubans. So they give a version of history that is consistent with the ideology of the Communist Party of Cuba. We used to do more of this. When I was a young person so many decades ago, and I was in my first assignment in Botswana, in Southern Africa, we used to give out books because they used English as their teaching language. We used to, and I would be received like a god to come with a truck full of books to a school that had few, not many books. And I was, feted like a wonderful person, and our country was seen that way. And I can guarantee you a shipment of rifles would not have received the same sorts of reception, but we aren't doing it, and nobody is talking about it. And so that's what has to start. People have to start the talk, the conversation, and get people interested. I think in the long run, though, it's the only way out of this situation. That with education, and I'm not the only one, you can watch Fareed Zakaria yesterday, and they had a discussion that touched on this, that ultimately it's a matter of raising the level of getting people out of poverty, getting them out of ignorance, so that when someone talks to them about this religious belief set that they have, they can answer, they can say something back. And that right now is not an option. Yes, sir.
Do you sense that there's any undercurrent with the women of the Middle East, excluding Israel, for liberation the way we saw women's liberation in the 60s?
Is there a current in the Middle East of women for liberation, for equality, for human rights? I would say yes. And we must be careful when we talk about the Middle East. Tunisia, remember the Arab Spring when it started in 2009? And we had all these high hopes. The only country that came out of the Arab Spring with a democracy was Tunisia. And they, at first they elected a significant number of Islamists, but then the second election they kicked most of them out too. And they have some women in their government and some women in parliament, and they're moving up in the system. So it's not inherently unacceptable in the, let's say, the westernized version of Islam. It certainly is unacceptable in Saudi Arabia, the Taliban, and now ISIS. It's not something they want. They explain it, they justify it, women justify it to me and say, I feel violated when I go out without a burqa. I feel the hostility, men, feeling they can do anything. So it's something culturally that we're not ready to address. Saudi Arabia has opened one university that allows women to study. They can't work yet with men. They can't drive to the university. But it's a little crack in the door, and they may crack down, they may let it grow, we don't know. But what they're selling in terms of Wahhabism around the Middle East is still this very extreme version.
I have a personal question for you. I've heard you speak on a few occasions, and you seem to be kind of a maverick, coming from a long history of working for the government. And so, how is that for you personally? I mean, you are very well entrenched, I guess, in thinking about these. Just sitting here for an hour, my stomach's in a knot. Thinking, God, I don't want to think about this all the time, and you do think about all of it. How do you cope with that? And how? And then, how are you now compared to like 25 years ago or 30 years ago when you were working?
This is getting very personal. Let me say thank you that you've been to other presentations. The fact that your stomach is in a knot means that it's been a successful hour. I'm not consumed by these problems. Let me tell you that in 40 years of working in first being a draftee in the Army and then going on to working in foreign policy as a practitioner, and now teaching at our local college. These problems are always complicated. They are always seemingly impossible to solve. And what I tell my students is that when you walk into the office on your first day, you've just replaced someone else, and you are now, as I have been, the officer in charge of Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia at the National Security Council, one of 4. And my baby was Ukraine, okay? Well, I didn't get a clean piece of paper that said, Ukraine, what should we do? I got a piece of paper with all kinds of scribbling on it that said, Ukraine, this is what we've done so far. And that is because it's all cumulative. It comes over a long period of time in history. And I can talk to you about, you know, Eastern and Western Ukraine and how the end of the First World War created this problem. And what I would say is that the depth of anyone's knowledge of the history will greatly help you understand the present problem. Because they don't come out of nowhere. The Shia-Sunni split didn't start when ISIS came along or when the Taliban came along. It started in 632 AD. And so you need to know that, and you need to know why it carried on for so long and how they feel about each other. Because you can't say, well, the Sunnis and the Shia need to stop fighting. Well, I'm sorry. You know, they believe something that the other considers to be heresy. I didn't say which one. They both do. They agree on that. And so these deep, deep beliefs. And we once had an adversary who believed deeply, for a while anyway, in communism, in the dictatorship of the proletariat, stuff we don't hear anything about anymore. And so that faded away, and we have democracy. These are labels that we hang our hat on, but they are often not very clear. I am feeling pretty good. I've lost a lot of weight, so don't worry though, it was intentional, so that's good. Thank you all very much.